welcome to everyone who is joining us today. It's great to see your faces. I wish we were in person, but feel free to eat your lunch, relax, kick back, be comfortable. Rabbi Antine and I have been doing this for 6 years now. Usually this shiur takes place at midnight. And when members of our communities have come together for this wonderful late night shiur, which I don't know about you, but it's really a highlight of this Chag for me. That and cheesecake are my two favorite parts of this holiday. But obviously this year's a little different. So we're meeting you in this format, but in the spirit of Torati al ta'azovu, we didn't want to give up or forsake this tradition. So who knows, maybe some of you will be more awake this year at the noon hour versus the midnight hour. There could be a benefit. So we wanted to address the issue of pikuach nefesh this year for obvious reasons, as the world faces this global pandemic and we are being faced with all kinds of healthcare challenges and issues and questions. We want to talk a little bit about how our tradition speaks to some of the issues that we're facing today by sharing some tshuvot that emanate from our respective movements about the issue of pikuach nefesh. So I'm going to begin, and then Rabbi Antine will follow. I think it's fair to say, yes, thank you, Rabbi Antine. If you want to post questions as we go along, you can use the chat. We'll save some time at the end for some open discussion. I think it's fair to say that one of the most identifiable and overarching Jewish values is this idea of pikuach nefesh. It's one of those phrases, one of those vocabulary words, if you will, that many Jews are familiar with. The idea that saving a human life is considered so important, so fundamental, right, that all but 3 mitzvot must be violated, not may be violated or should be violated or could be violated, but must be violated in order to save a human life. It would be hard to point to something more intrinsically Jewish in terms of values than pikuach nefesh. Moreover, I think Jewish law tends to set aside what we might call mitigating circumstances or utilitarian considerations. What do I mean by that? Even when a person is elderly or infirm or weak or no longer an active participating member of society in terms of their employment or whatever else you might deem as useful to the community, Judaism says life is a life. Life is sacred at every stage, at every moment, at every end of the spectrum. And Jewish law insists that prolonging it and preserving it and protecting it are supreme values. I'm thinking about my maternal grandmother, who lived for almost a decade in the Jewish nursing home in Cleveland, where Rabbi Antine and I are from. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, and for many of those years, she didn't know anyone. She couldn't take care of herself. Her most basic personal needs, couldn't feed herself, couldn't see to her own hygiene, or really didn't know anyone. But she was nevertheless cared for with dignity and compassion for many years until she died of natural causes. She didn't have much to offer society, so to speak. She didn't have much to offer to her family, for that matter, but she was alive. And that's what counted. Because she was alive, she deserved medical care. She deserved the assistance, the support, the compassion that nursing home provided her. So just to be clear, we're not talking about hospice care or palliative care, where halacha has a whole lot to say about that, and that's kind of a different category of healthcare decision-making. But the challenge that we now face during a global pandemic is how to apply Judaism's supreme value that we place on life when there are limited life-saving resources. Put simply, when you can't save everyone, how do you decide who to save and who to treat and who not to? Essentially, as we say in the High Holiday liturgy, right? Mi yichye umi yamut. Who will live and who will die? There's a term for this, and it comes from a military context. It's the battlefield setting, if you will, where medics have to decide which wounded soldiers to treat and which they have to allow to die. And that term is triage. In the current pandemic situation, triage is the process of evaluating and decision-making when the medical system is overwhelmed, when there are so many cases and not enough life-saving resources or medical devices or even hospital beds to respond to the enormity of need. In the past several months, there have been shortages of ventilators. And by the way, we don't even think about this, but there's a whole host of medicines that are used to treat patients while they're on ventilators, sedatives, anesthetics, painkillers, muscle relaxants. There's a shortage in all of those resources. There's a shortage of respirators, oxygen supplies, testing kits, nasal swabs, other supplies needed for testing, PPE, an acronym that is now part of all of our vocabulary, right? Personal protective equipment, N95 masks, face shields, gowns, even hospital beds. Physical space for treatment has been in some areas in short supply. You probably remember those terrible images from that hospital in northern Italy where the emergency room is totally overwhelmed and people are in hallways and outside rooms and not being treated in the ways that they are meant to be, so overwhelmed. And we probably can safely assume that as vaccines are developed, there will most likely not be at the outset enough vaccine to treat every person who needs it when they need it. So how do you take Judaism's overarching demand that life be preserved and protected, and that we do not discriminate among patients, like my grandmother, right? Or score them for whose life is more valuable than another's in a time of a pandemic when shortages and scarcity of life-saving equipment and therapies is a very real concern. So the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which is the conservative movement's halachic decision-making body, in attempting to address this situation and to provide guidance for medical clinicians and ethicists and public health officials and rabbis and chaplains, recently passed 2 tshuvot, and by recently I mean like earlier this month. I mean, this is hot off the presses. Recently passed 2 tshuvot. Tshuvot are halachic responsa pieces, right? In other words, a halachic framework for addressing a question, a contemporary question. One that was authored by Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who is the current chair of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, and the other by Rabbi Daniel Nevins, who's the dean of the Rabbinical School at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where I graduated 18 years ago this past week. Can I get a big mazel tov, please? I didn't hear a thing. I can't hear you. Anyway, so I should mention that there are triage protocols in place in the medical community. And even various states have instituted their own protocols. But you might have heard of the SOFA score, the Sequential Organ Failure Assessment Score, which is based on analyzing the dysfunction of 6 major organ systems and the likelihood of morbidity. And that's used to understand then how to apply scarce medical supplies and treatments based on a person's likelihood to die. Ezekiel Emanuel, by the way, that's the brother of Rahm Emanuel, developed a scoring system called Fair Allocation of Scarce Medical Resources in the Time of COVID-19, which, listen to this, prioritizes care for frontline healthcare workers who are essential to pandemic response. You understand what that means, right? Healthcare workers get first dibs at life-saving treatments and devices. And then according to Emmanuel's system, after that, resources go to either the sickest or younger people who will have lived the longest if they die untreated. My grandmother would not have made any of those lists if she was alive and infected with COVID-19 today. More seriously, it is entirely conceivable under these protocols that an infected person who has been being treated on a ventilator, a patient who's responding well on a ventilator, could be forcibly removed from ventilation because of the critical need of another patient who is prioritized based on the reasons and protocols I just described. And that person in need of that same device. That is a real issue, not only in biomedical ethics, but also in halacha. So from a halachic point of view, there's very little discussion, actually. This might come as a surprise to you. There's very little discussion of the issue of medical triage in classical rabbinic texts for the simple reason that pre-modern medicine was not all that effective. Our sages were good at a lot of things, but pre-modern medicine was not one of them. So there wasn't, frankly, a whole lot to talk about. The Dorf and Nevin's Tshuvot consider the cases in halacha of caring for the poor and pidyon shvuyim, the redemption of captives, as models for how the Jewish community determined who should receive limited communal resources and how to answer this anguishing question of whether you can let one person die in order to save many. So here's the central question. Can one person be denied treatment in a time of extreme scarcity in order to save others? Now, the Rambam, who's cited in both of these tshuvot, seems to only permit this in cases when the person who will not be treated, who will be denied life-saving treatment, is a patient that has been determined to be one who will certainly die. That's the only situation, according to the Rambam, where you can allow someone to be denied treatment so that someone else can live. Halachic literature is very wary about giving license to kill one person or sacrifice one person in order to save others. You might remember the debate around Gilad Shalit a few years ago, right? The IDF soldier who was abducted by Hamas, held in captivity for 5 years, denied access to the Red Cross or medical attention, who was ultimately released after 5 years of captivity, but released in exchange for over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, including among them terrorists and convicted murderers. Now, on the one hand, the state of Israel upheld the mitzvah. They could say the Jewish state upheld the mitzvah of redeeming captives. The IDF could say that it continued its commitment to not leaving a soldier behind on the battlefield. On the other hand, there was tremendous risk to Israelis in terms of future abductions, if the captors know that they're going to get their demands met, not to mention the recidivism of the people who were released. So ultimately, Israel took the risk, paid a heavy price, won Gilad's freedom, but not without tremendous public debate, and it was vociferous debate on both sides. In the collection of halachic responsa called the Sidrei Eish by Rabbi Yerachmiel Yaakov Weinberg, he writes, Chaye Rabim lo nitnu lahatzala al yedei shfichat damim shel nefesh achat. You cannot kill one person in order to save many lives. Rabbi Dorf's tshuva allows, in this extreme situation of global pandemic, that a viable patient could in fact be denied scarce medical resources or even be removed from them, like a ventilator, in order to treat one or more patients. Rabbi Nevins, on the other hand, does not see sufficient halachic support for such an extreme measure. There's an interesting source in the Pri Megadim, an 18th century collection of responsa by Rabbi Yosef ben Meir Teomim, that presents the following scenario. Two patients, one of them is in greater danger than the other, but there are only enough resources to treat one of them. Then he says the patient in certain danger has priority over the patient who is in possible danger or less imminent danger. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein understood this principle in terms of the categories that he used were treifa, a person who's not expected to live out the year, versus a patient with cheskat chayim shelo, who is expected to live and therefore should be prioritized. The one who's expected to live should be prioritized over one who is a treifa, one who is not expected to live out the year. And Rabbi Feinstein said, if you can't determine which is which, in other words, it's hard to tell from symptoms and from diagnosis which one is more likely to live, which, by the way, is the case in certain situations of COVID-19 when, right, symptoms don't always present themselves before respiratory failure. Rabbi Feinstein said the way to decide is by lottery. Right? Rabbi Menashe Klein, a Hasidic 20th century posek, wrote that a ventilator can definitely be removed from a dying patient in order to save a patient who has a better chance of survival. He wrote, Ya'aviru ota v'itnuha le'adam hashalem. Take that ventilation machine off of the person who is dying and hook it up, give it over to the person who has a chance of surviving. Now, Rabbi Nevins writes forcefully in his tshuva, a medical resource may not be taken from one person and given to another on the grounds that the latter is younger, generally healthier, expected to live a greater number of years, or somehow more valuable to society, including their occupation as a medical professional. That's not enough reason to take a medical resource from one person to give it to another. Such criteria would undermine, he writes, our fundamental belief that all people are created in the divine image and that life has infinite worth. It would run counter to the cardinal rule, ein dofin nefesh mipnei nefesh, we do not take one life to save another. Only if the current user of the ventilator is determined to be terminally ill, you should hear the Rambam in this statement, or requests termination of therapy because of suffering, may the scarce resource be allocated to save another life. Rabbi Dorf, on the other hand, argues that healthcare personnel should indeed receive preferential treatment in triage decisions over those who are not involved directly in saving lives. Rabbi Dorf argues that this is an extension of the principle of pikuach nefesh, namely that by giving priority to healthcare professionals, you have the ability, by extension, to save more lives. Rabbi Nevins totally rejects the idea that pikuach nefesh can be quantified, right, in terms of numbers of lives saved. He finds that there is little to no support in halachic literature for such a contention. Now, these are all very complex issues and really deserve a lot longer treatment, but I'll conclude by just reading the psak din, the ultimate conclusion of the tshuvot. And the psak din brings together the points where Rabbi Dorf and Rabbi Nevins agree. All right, so here it goes, and then I'll stop and Rabbi Antine can continue. So they say the following: our respective responsa addressed many of the medical, logistical, moral, and spiritual challenges of medical triage in a crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic. While our presentations differ in approach and presentation, and we reach some incompatible positions, we agree on the following practical conclusions. Number one, equal access to medical care is a moral and halachic imperative. Triage decisions must not be based on criteria other than the best chance to save lives. Number two, scarce resources used to prevent infections such as personal protection equipment and vaccines may be assigned on a priority basis to medical professionals and other emergency responders in order to support them in their life-saving efforts. Number three, Jewish law differentiates between brief respite, chayei sha'ah, and recovery, chayei olam. Scarce medical resources may be directed towards patients who are expected with this therapy to recover over those who are not expected to recover, even with this therapy. Diagnostic tools such as the sequential organ failure assessment may be used to prioritize allocation of scarce medical resources towards patients who may be rescued and away from those who are not expected to survive hospital discharge. There are two more. Number four, if a patient is already receiving medical therapy and is responding, they may not be removed from the equipment prematurely in order to rescue the life of another person based on comparison of the two patients' age, ability, general health, or social status. The only criterion for removing a person from therapy is the determination that they cannot survive hospital discharge or their own request to shift to palliative care. And finally, if the triage officer, part of the tshuvot, state that these decisions cannot be made by frontline medical caregivers. It's too anguishing. It's too fraught with difficulty. There should be a third party, a triage officer, who from something of a distance evaluates the prognoses and the likelihood for survival, and they call that a triage officer. that person determines that a patient cannot be saved and that their medical resources must be allocated to another patient in urgent need, the basis for this decision must be fully explained, sensitively explained to the patient or their representative, and the hospital must continue to support the patient with appropriate palliative and pastoral care, maintaining the respect and dignity of the patient until the end. So I encourage you to read the tshuvot in full. They're all available in English on the website of the Rabbinical Assembly with extensive citations. And certainly, even after this session, I remain available to continue the discussion and to continue to look at the finer points. And with that, I turn it over to my friend and colleague.
Thank you, Rabbi Raskin. Wow, that was so interesting to learn all about triage in halacha. You know, it's interesting. We decided before that you were going to speak about, you were going to teach from some tshuvot from the conservative movement, and I would do from the Orthodox movement. But we didn't necessarily say which aspect of pikuach nefesh. But so I was a little nervous before that maybe you were going to speak exactly on my topic, and it would just be mix and matching different names, but really basically the same presentation. But it turns out that I'm really addressing a different area of pikuach nefesh. So we're going to have different thinkers, different poskim, and also really a different aspect of the pikuach nefesh question. So while Rabbi Raskin spoke about triage in halacha, when it comes to multiple people who are in a situation of sakanas nefashos, who would all clearly fall under the situation of pikuach nefesh, but maybe one person has more of a right, either because they have more of a need or because one is maybe a medical professional, all the different factors that Rabbi Raskin considered. The question that I'm going to really focus on is how far does pikuach nefesh actually go? Meaning, what chance that the person's life is really in danger, and how far out could the concern be that we're still going to actually treat something as pikuach nefesh? And since I'm not going to be talking about triage issues where the question is giving care to one person versus the other, so the dilemma will not be about giving it to different people. The dilemma that I'm going to work with is when you're dealing with cases of pikuach nefesh, or maybe even questionable pikuach nefesh, what happens when that comes up against other mitzvot, like Shabbos, or we'll see issues of nivel hameis, desecration of the dead, or many, many other halachot, going to the mikveh, having a bris. I mean, we're just going to touch on some of them. But basically, that's going to be the question. I'll give you an example, a question that I got. I'll mention two questions that I got throughout the last few months. Both of them came more to the beginning of the COVID situation. One of them was there are a number of members of Beth Sholom who, I don't know if they're still doing it, I haven't followed up with them, but they were very, very actively working and trying to come up with a test, one of the tests in the beginning. The question was, could they go into work on Shabbos to design, to implement, to create the test that would hopefully test COVID patients? So you think about it, okay, first of all, maybe they'll be successful and maybe they won't. Maybe even if they're successful in coming up with a test, maybe it would have been from their work from Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Who said that the work on Shabbos will actually have an impact? Even if they come up with a test, who says it'll be approved by the FDA? Even if it is approved by the FDA, there are a zillion other tests. So who's to prove that any one person is saved because of that test, right? And furthermore, the test is just going to prove that you are sick, which means that now you have to let other people know. It becomes so far away. So do we just say, oh, we're in pandemic, everything goes, you know? Or does there have to be a direct correlation between the violation, whether it's violating Shabbos, as in that example, or many other isur, many other potential prohibitions, and the life-saving measure? How direct does it have to be? I mean, if you want to take it so far, if you just, let's go down this rabbit hole for a second. Okay, maybe I can make the argument that forever, for the rest of life, anybody who works in the field of developing PPE, right, or any medical things, right, should be able to work every Shabbos for the rest of their life. Why? Because maybe they'll do something, maybe they'll produce something, and then another pandemic will come, and we don't even know which PPE will be necessary for that, and therefore they should always be able to work, because maybe it's sakanas nefashos, right? We have a principle that obviously the pasuk says v'chai b'hem, you have to live with the mitzvahs v'lo sheyamos and not die by doing mitzvahs. So therefore, as Rabbi Raskin said, you can violate up to 610 mitzvahs, except for idolatry, sexual prohibitions, and murder, in order to save a life. Sakanas nefashos, hatzalos nefashos, pikuach nefesh overrides everything. All right, that's a great principle. And not only that, we even say Suffice pikuach nefesh, even if it's a question, right? So the Gemara talks about the case where you encounter a fallen wall on Shabbos, and you're not sure if someone's under the wall, right? So if someone's there, then of course you're allowed to do it. But who knows it? Who says for sure someone's there? There might not be someone there. So we say even if there's a chance. And some of the poskim say that, you know, the principle is ein holchem b'pikuach nefesh achar harov. We don't follow the rov. Normally in Jewish law, we follow the majority. All right. So let's say that people say, I think there's like a 10% chance that maybe someone's there. So under normal halachic issues, what would you say? That's a minority. 90% chance no one's there. Don't violate Shabbos in order to move this wall. But no, ein holchem b'pikuach nefesh achar harov. We don't say that. And some poskim say, we even say, even if there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that someone's underneath that wall, you're going to save them. But fine, how far are we going to go? Are we going to say that from now on, for the rest of my life, I can work every day of my life because maybe there's going to be another depression in 5 years, and I'm going to lose my job, I'm not going to have money, I'm not going to have food, and I'm not going to be able to feed my children. So now I better start working right now on Shabbos in order to save up. Maybe 5 years from now, there'll be a situation of pikuach nefesh. In other words, ein ledavar sof, right? I mean, there's no end to pikuach nefesh. In a certain way, you could say, in fact, that's what really is being said right now, right? On the one hand, people who are saying we have to be very slow with reopening everything because of pikuach nefesh. But what's the other side saying, right? They're saying, well, there's the economy, and even the economy itself. If enough people lose their job, certainly rates of depression will go up and rates of suicide will go up. So there's pikuach nefesh really on the other side too. In other words, if you think about it, almost every argument can be made that at the end of the argument is pikuach nefesh. So are there any limits on pikuach nefesh? So I want to teach a tshuva from the Noda B'Yehuda, Rabbi Cheskel Landau, who makes a limit on it. But I just want to first put out like a few more like interesting questions, and I won't necessarily get to all the questions. But I just listened to a share from Rav Asher Weiss, and just even listening to the share was such a pleasure. I can send anyone the link afterwards. Rav Asher Weiss, by the way, is a very important posek in Israel right now. I actually have a little pamphlet of his right now. It's called, his truvas are called Minchas Asher, and he published just 2 months ago 100 pages on Shuvot for Corona issues in Hebrew. On many wide range of topics. First of all, Rav Asher Weiss, he actually grew up in America, in Brooklyn. He was a Kleisenberg Chassid, so he's a Chassidish person. His family moved to Israel in like in the 1960s. And so he obviously speaks English fluently, but also Hebrew. He's very, very respected in the Haredi community. He basically is a product of the Haredi community. But it seems that at a certain point, I don't know when, he certainly became a Zionist. You could tell even just listening to him talk about Israel, his strong love for Medinat Israel. After Rav Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer, who was the posek for Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, after he passed away a few years ago, I believe that I know for sure that Rav Asher Weiss is now the posek for Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, but I think he became the head posek after that happened. He's also a posek for the IDF, for the Mossad. He has fascinating questions that come to him. So I just want to throw out, I was listening to a share from him on Pikuach Nefesh, and he threw out some very, very interesting questions that he raises. Okay, he gave one very interesting example. He said, let's say he's a posek for Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. Let's say there's a nurse. A frum nurse asked him the following question, that one of the protocols of the hospital is that every time medicine is given to any patient, it has to be written down in the records, right? In the computer, in the records, whatever, it has to be written down. Potential melacha doraisa. We're learning the Daf Yomi all about co-save. You're not allowed to write on Shabbos, right? Maybe if you write with the computer, it will only be an Isser D'Rabbanan, rabbinic violation, but you clearly cannot write it down. Now, their protocol is very important, obviously, right? If all nurses at Shaarei Tzedek Hospital ignore the protocol and they never write down what medicine they give to people, then over time, definitely people will die because information will not be there for the doctors, for the nurses. They won't know everything about the patient, and something wrong might happen and people will die for it. So it's definitely big gadol in general, pikuach nefesh, to write it down. But here's a nurse, and one of her patients says, oh, he has a little headache, his head's hurting. So can she give him some Tylenol? So she gives him Tylenol. There's no question in her mind that there's no pikuach nefesh on her writing down that she happened to give him Tylenol. But the general rule is that if everyone would take that decision into their own hands, it could of course lead to pikuach nefesh concerns. Okay, here, I thought this was like so interesting. He gets questions from the Mossad. So you have people in enemy territory, and they are basically, during the whole time that they're in enemy territory, they can't wear tefillin, they can't do anything from the question of how far concerns go with that. And the issue was that what came up, it wasn't about that in terms of the pikuach nefesh. You just mentioned that as an aside, was, every single time that the Mossad is getting data, or the Shin Bet, I don't know what all the different agencies are, every time they're supposed to write it down. Now, 98% of what they record and put down doesn't end up having any pikuach nefesh value. But every once in a while, there's something. So can people take these decisions into their own mind? All right, I'll leave it there in terms of some of the questions. They're just some ideas. I'm just trying to present the idea that it's very easy for us just to say, pikuach nefesh is docha kol mitzvos, pikuach nefesh overrides all mitzvos except for the big three. But how far are we going to say based on that? If the person can go and they can, if they're a scientist and they're trying to discover a vaccine, forget about right now during the pandemic. You're trying to discover anything. You're trying to do basic research. Maybe your basic research will come up with something that 10 years from now will be the next vaccine to the next pandemic. So maybe now you can work every single Shabbos for the rest of your life. How far does it go? So there's a famous tshuva from Rabbi Landau, the Nod of Yehuda. He is a rabbi from Poland, lived in the 18th century, very, very important posting. And what happened was, he was asked the question by rabbis from London. There was a big debate in London in the, 1750s, 1760s, I just made up that time, but sometime around there, where what happened was, there was a person who died in the hospital from gallstones. He had gallstones. They tried to do a surgery. The doctors messed up on the surgery. Maybe it was early stages of doing that particular surgery, and the person died. The question was, after the person died, could you do an autopsy on this person? Because the doctors wanted to learn from their mistakes, so the next time around, when they have someone who has the same thing, they would be able to do a better surgery. Now, what is the halachic issue with doing an autopsy? Who cares? It's not about violating Shabbos. What's the problem? Well, the problem with doing an autopsy is what's called nivel hames. Right? You're not allowed to do a desecration to the body. You're not allowed to do a desecration to a corpse. So on the one hand, you have nivel hames. It's an isser. It's a biblical prohibition. You cannot desecrate a body. It's not one of the big three. On the other hand, what do you have? Potential hatzalos nefashos, saving people's lives, because the next time someone comes along with the same exact disease, maybe the doctors will be more informed. And there was a debate back and forth with the rabbis in London, and the particular rabbi who sent the Nod of Yehuda the question had actually ruled that it was permitted because of Suffice sakonis nefashos. Even if there's a question that maybe someone will come tomorrow or the next week or the next year or any time throughout this doctor's career who's going to do the autopsy and learn the information, maybe it's okay. Obviously, this has relevance to the issue of donating your body to science, for medical research. Okay, so what does the Nod of Yehuda say? He says, as kol eila kasatu fi divrechem, she'atem kodem ze pikuach v'atzalos nefesh. All of my deliberations up until this point, he had a whole deliberation on it, is only true because you are trying to consider this case pikuach nefesh. Avalani tama. I have a big problem with this. If you're going to call this saving a life, in Cain, then you don't have to go through all of your deliberations. The halacha is explicit that you could save the person. But he says, the omnam, it's not true. However, it's not true. This is not a case of pikuach nefesh to do an autopsy on the fellow who had the gallstones and the surgery was messed up. to try to learn from their mistakes. That's not called pikuach nefesh. Why? Because the only time we call something pikuach nefesh is b'yesh safek sakanas nefashos lefanenu. It has to be before us. Kigon chola, there's a person who's sick, there's an actual person before us, or there's a questionable person before us, meaning there's a pile of stones, and if there's a person under that pile, then that person is right here before us. There's a specific person who we're trying to save. But he says, Avo b'nidan didan, in this case with the autopsy, ein kan shum chol hatzarach lazeh. There's no specific, it's not like there's another patient in the next bed or over on the other side of the hospital who's going to benefit from this. Raksha wrote him lilmod chochma zu. You just want to learn a little bit more about the wisdom about doing this kind of surgery. Because maybe in 5 years from now or a year from now, another person will need the same thing. So he says, there's no way we're going to violate any isser, or afilu isser drabanan, even if it's not biblical, even if it's only rabbinic. If you're going to call this chashash, safek nefashos, im kain yakol melechas harafua, then all medicine, all medicine preparation, like let's say all medicine production, preparing the knives for surgery. Let's say you work in a plant in a company that creates surgical equipment. You should be able to work on Shabbos because maybe we're going to run out of hospital beds. Okay, let's say the whole ventilator question that Rabbi Raskin spoke about, right? So now who knows what the next thing is going to be? Maybe from now on, every single person who works in a ventilator company should have to work every Shabbos for the rest of their life. And that's only the disease that's before us. Maybe in 5 years from now or 10, maybe the next one will have something else that we don't even know. So maybe everyone working in every field has to work every single Shabbos because maybe in the future it'll save someone. So therefore he basically says, you cannot do this. You're not allowed to do this. It has to be that the chol is b'fanenu. And that language of chol b'fanenu took on great halachic weight. Now the truth of the matter is, this is a very, I don't know if the right word is easy, but I'm going to use the word easy. It's an easy argument to make when you're the Noida B'Yehuda, or you're Cheskel Landau, living in Poland in the 18th century. But what if you're Rav Asher Weiss, or the Tzitz Eliezer, or you're any posek working for Shari Tzedek Hospital, or if you're a posek working for the Mossad, or working for Israel Security, right? Many things that they do, there's no sakana bifanenu, right? Gathering intelligence, there's no sakana, there's no person who's sick before us. It's a question of gathering this information might, a year from now or 10 years, who knows, some operations are clandestine for years and years until something comes out, and 9 times out of 10 it doesn't come out, but it's worth doing it. So it's never bifanenu. So it's easy for Rabbi Cheskel Landau to say this in the 18th century, and who is he passing for? A specific person. And most who is he passing for? A community. But if you're all of a sudden a posek for the state of Israel, right? If you rule that autopsies aren't permitted, and if you rule that medical students in Israel can't do medical research, then what's going to be the problem? You're not going to be able to have doctors in Israel who are going to know it, and then it definitely will be sakanas nefashos. So more contemporary poskim, especially because of this idea of Jewish people having to actually control a state when it's issues of medical issues, whether it's issues of security, all these issues. Therefore, they have, like, I'll give you an example. There's major debates after 1948 in terms of police. How could police operate on Shabbos? All right. So the police department gets a call, somebody's running 911, someone's running after someone, there's a real sakana, no question, right? What does the Jewish police officer do? They jump into the police car, they drive there, they could save someone's life, no question about it. Okay, what if the police gets a call that, someone just robbed my house, they stole things, I need to file a police report. Can the police get into their car to drive to someone's house to file a police report? Is there sakanas nefashos there, right? So again, if you're answering the question for a particular individual, like if I have a particular question for me, right? Should I take my temperature on Shabbos because maybe it's a symptom for COVID? And then maybe the answer is no. But let's say I'm working with the whole state and deciding whether or not all people who are entering the hospitals in all of Israel during a COVID pandemic, should they have to have their temperature taken? the answer might be yes, right? Because you're dealing with it on the global scale, you're dealing with it on a different level. So if police in general don't go and file police reports, then what will be the result of that? Criminals will feel like they can do more things on Shabbos, and that will actually lead to pikuach nefesh. Because if the more they're out there, then there could be conflicts, and it could actually lead. And also there's a concept called hatzal de rabbim, which means in halacha, even if it's not a direct pikuach nefesh, but if it's the rabbim, the whole community is possibly even in danger to be injured, halacha sort of upgrades that also to situations of pikuach nefesh for various reasons, including the way that I would even think about economic possible concerns, where if you have enough people having great economic difficulties and challenges, this could lead to sakonas vashus, whereas you're dealing with one person, maybe the answer is different. But anyways, that's what Rav Lando said, the Noid Behuda. That became very, very prominent, and I see my time is running out, but I do want to just tie this up a little bit. So, truth of the matter is, the Chazon Ish, right, who is not exactly known to be a liberal, lenient posek, lived in Israel, he's a very important posek in the 50s and 60s. He said, he read the Tshuva of the Noid Behuda, and even though it was greatly accepted, he said it's not about bifanenu or not bifanenu, whether it's before us or not. It really has to do with whether or not it is something which is common. Even if it's not bifanenu, if it's common, if there's a pandemic around, if there's some clear reason that this will be very significant and very important, he would upgrade that, even if there's no specific chola before us, sick person before us. A lot of the way that a lot of poskim articulate this is, like during a time of pandemic, a lot of these things would be permitted. So for instance, what did I say, with the help of my Rabbi, of course, Rabbi Linzer, what did I say to the people who asked me about working on Shabbos? I said that, since we are in this situation, the pandemic, they could do it, but they have to really minimize all chil Shabbos. You don't just say that just because it's a situation of maybe questionable pikuach nefesh, that then they can get in the car. They would have to take an Uber, they would ride their bike, or whatever. There's different ways to get there. And obviously anything that they would have to write down, they'd have to do with the shinoi, with the not in the normal way that it's done, klach or yad. So there are a lot of halachic ways around that. So anyways, that's just some of the background to this topic. So the answer is yes, there is limitations on the concept of pikuach nefesh. It can't just be that maybe something that I do will eventually come, but if it's a common, that's the way that the Chazon Ish says it. Another posek, Reb Shol Yisrael, maybe I'll just read this final psak. Reb Shol Yisrael was a posek, he was the Rosh Yeshiva of America's Arav. A lot of people in the army and the IDF followed his halachic rulings. His sefer is called Amud HaYemini, the right pillar. He was also very much on the right in terms of Israeli politics and also in terms of the religious Zionist community religiously as well. But anyways, he was much more permissive in allowing the IDF and the security establishment and also the police to do more on Shabbos because of pikuach nefesh. I'm just going to read you this paragraph. We learn from here the rule that even pikuach nefesh that is not before us, meaning the Noid Behuda said it has to be before us, but he's saying even if it's not before us, he quotes an example from the Rambam. The Rambam says that if people are in danger, if a certain part of the Jewish community is being attacked on Shabbos, you can go with your weapons, and then when you're done, you're allowed to go home. Oh, I understand why you can go there, but why are you allowed to go home? It's similar to the issue of doctors going to the hospital, then we even allow them to go home. So the Rambam says, because if you don't let them go home, what will happen? Next time around, they're not going to be so quick to help out. So obviously, what are you doing? Because of some future, it's not bifanenu, the sakana is not here, because in 5 years, the situation might arise again, you're allowed to do it. So Rav Shol Yisraeli quotes that idea, and he says from there we see that even if it's not at this moment, but it's clear to us that it will arrive at some point in the future, we view it as if it were already before us. For this obligation of, and he shall live, is constantly before us, not only with respect to life at the moment, but rather we are constantly commanded to worry about the state of life that will be in the future, even though we don't know when or how. It seems then that there is also no room to make distinctions based on the frequency of that which will come in the future. For even if there's only a 1 in 1,000 chance of it occurring, for the saving of one life at some time in the future suffices to allow and to obligate performing these actions of Shabbos desecration, which fall into the category of preparations of such rescue. So Rav Shol Yisraeli was very lenient with the military establishment in Israel, with the security, with intelligence, for them to continue doing violations of malacha on Shabbos, because it is clear that in the future, this information at least has a 1 in 1,000 chance that it will actually save lives. So it's a very complicated issue. Obviously, people are talking in shuls now about having thermal temperature takers as everybody walks into shul. Can we just make this general thing? Also, this has huge relevance to issues of CSS, community-based security in shul. Again, if you really treat the tshuva of the Noda B'Yehuda and say the person has to be right before us, there's really no room to be lenient in a lot of these cases, unless you can argue that they're really not being Mechal Shabbos in the first place. But with some of the more modern Shavuot, especially ones that come out of Israel, because they have a change in mind because of the founding of the state of Israel, there certainly is a lot more leniency. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. How should we take it from here, Rabbi Raskin? Open it up?
Well, so first of all, someone did type in a question, which is wonderful, but I think we can also, I think the best way to do this is for people to type into the chat so we're not all kind of talking at the same time or on top of each other. I just wanted to give a shout out to one of our former midnight darshanim. I see Rabbanit Dasi Fruchter on the Zoom, and it's great to see Dasi. I messaged her, please teach something. I miss hearing your Torah, but she declined. But it's great to see your face and to kind of be reunited in this way. So there was a question typed into the chat from Paula Tobenfeld, who said, I would like to use sakana lenafsho or sakanat nefashot as the limitator for organ donation in my advanced medical directive, i.e., there must be a person at that moment to receive my organ. How do the rabbis feel about this? I completely support that idea. Again, based on the ideas that Rabbi Antine spoke of in terms of nivul hamet and kavod hamet, that we don't unnecessarily desecrate the body or interfere with the body, with the deceased, that halachic organ donation should be understood in the context of a ready recipient, that there should be someone who is identified, who needs that particular organ that is being harvested. It's a terrible expression to say it that way, but who has a demonstrated need for that live organ transplant. And so I think that, like, the Halachic Organ Donor Society and the Rabbinical Assembly's advanced healthcare directives include that provision, that there is a ready and identified recipient for the organ that's being donated. So I certainly think that's an important criteria. Did you want to add anything, Rabbi Antine?
No, I mean, the only thing I would say is that I have heard people talk in interesting ways about the tshuva of the Noda B'Yehuda that I mentioned, which is, obviously in his days, the idea that there was someone who had gallstones in a particular hospital in Poland, or actually the case was in London, who knows if there was someone else at the same time. But nowadays, because of global communication, like it breaks all that down, because there's always someone who will benefit at that moment. There's always, what do we say, chola b'fanenu? So for the Noda B'Yehuda, it meant in your particular hospital. Chola b'fanenu, sick before us, nowadays might mean the whole world, because we have access to the whole world, and so same thing with organ donation, right? There are organ donor lists, right? So even if the sick person is not in this particular hospital, the post can say, look, if there's going to be people on the list, and we know for sure that even if there is no one on the list right now at this moment, there will be someone who will come within or certainly a good chance. So therefore, there's much more leniency around understanding the idea of chola b'fanenu in a global role. So that would be the only thing I would say.
Rabbanit Fruchter posted a comment or a question about pikuach nefesh as it applies to mental health. This is such an important question. How might some of the principles that we're discussing, triage, the sick person being in front of you, apply? Seems that there was a huge shift when the OU started. Strong pikuach nefesh language right before Pesach this year about isolation and mental health. Rabbi Antine, you want to respond?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, I think it was interesting. I know there was a tshuva from Rav Hershel Schachter, and also actually Rav Asher Weiss also wrote a tshuva about this, regarding the whole thing about the Zoom Seder, right? Everyone was very interested. A lot of people were interested in the Zoom Seder, which obviously presented a major halachic issue about having the computer on Pesach and this and that. And Rav Hershel Schachter was opposed to the idea of the Zoom Seder, but for the purpose of having a Seder. He said you should do something before, and that's what many of the Orthodox poskim were saying, just do the Seder before. But he did say that, forget about the Seder. He says if someone is in isolation, there's a real question of Safek Pikuach Nefashos, of a question of, definitely suicide rates might go up. We cannot be careful enough with this. There you would say the chola is b'fanenu, it's a specific person. And consequently, they forget about the Seder. You can just call them 20 times over Pesach and over Shabbos. And I know that we sent out information from Har Shalom. I also saw an email from Rabbi Fruchter to the same way. I don't know what you did, Rabbi Raskin, but saying that people can call us. We put out our phone numbers, and people were able to call us over Shabbos or Yontif. Again, not for what I think was so interesting from Rav Hershel Schachter. What he did was, instead of being lenient on the Zoom Seder, he said, it's not about the Zoom Seder. He says it was much more liberal, much more lenient and expansive in terms of the concept of Pikuach Nefesh, applying also to mental health issues. And because of that, he said you can call them 5 times, and you should, and can maybe even you should actively reach out to people. So I think that this pandemic has definitely gotten, forced us to really think about issues of Pikuach Nefesh, not only as it relates to the pandemic and and Corona, but also as it relates to isolation and the impacts on mental health, for sure.
All I would say, in addition to everything which I certainly agree with, is that I think that we are going to continue to see the ramifications of the pandemic in terms of mental health for a long time to come, in terms of, as you mentioned, suicide rates and depression, but also, there was an amazing article recently about the increase of divorce rates and other domestic issues, domestic violence issues that have emerged out of this time period. There was a spike in Wuhan after that province reopened, of people filing for divorce, of people reporting domestic violence issues. So these are areas that I think we're going to have to continue to be very sensitive to and aware of, not just now, but in the months to come, and certainly after communities open and people continue to wrestle with the effects of this isolation. Elaine Snyder asks, what are the halachic guidelines if an autopsy is required by the police who ordered it because of the nature of the death? And so I think that would fall into the category of dina de malchut adina, right? That we the halachic concept that we abide by the law of the land. And certainly if the law of the land requires for a criminal investigation or matters like that there be an autopsy, that we support that. Obviously, similar to chola lefanenu, right? It shouldn't be for general, criminal inquiry, but because we're trying to solve this specific crime, and because there are evidentiary issues that could be discovered through an autopsy. But my guidance is always, God, thank God I haven't had so many situations of criminal death, but certainly has been to abide by dina de malchut adina, not try to somehow exempt a situation from autopsy in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, yeah, I do agree that it would be considered chola b'fanenu, because if the potential criminal is on the loose, and this will help us find the criminal, then that would obviously fall into that. I know that a lot of questions come up with autopsy, also specifically for Kohanim, because there's a specific idea of them being buried, 100% full in terms of rules of tumah, of their relatives being able to come in proximity to them. So I have been asked a number of times, because a lot of times, even if they just don't know the cause of death exactly, they want to do an autopsy. So I have been asked a few times to try to intervene and try to get an autopsy not done. I have done it a few times, because it really was not. It was really just they wanted to have general information. So I've tried that, and I think I was successful one of the times at least. specifically for a family of Kohen now.
So a couple more minutes before 1 o'clock strikes, not 1 a.m. unfortunately. But if anyone has any other questions or comments, type away.
Well, Rabbi Raskin, maybe we can like it's hard. We really didn't plan this part out before, so I don't know if something will come up. But do we think, just from like kind of peering over to the other community, do we feel like there are any differences in terms of how some of these issues of pikuach nefesh are playing out in terms of our communities, in terms of you know, whether it be, I don't know, might there be interest, do you at least observe any interesting differences around on that realm? I mean, it's interesting, for instance, like the tshuva that you presented on triage, right? That I've read, you know, different Orthodox poskim talking about the same thing, you know, very, very similar, obviously, you know, some of the language is very, very similar. And I don't know if there are any interesting distinctions, but I don't know if you've observed anything or if there's anything of note.
Nothing comes to mind, but I'm you know, I was intrigued to, you know, by these tshuvot, and particularly Rabbi Dorf's kind of, you know, willingness to go so far as to say that we can prioritize certain people over others, right? That we can prioritize frontline medical providers over, you know, over other people in terms of triage treatment. I was surprised to read that myself. And frankly, I'm not entirely comfortable with it, but
yeah. But how do you think it would work out, like on a practical level? So Rabbi Dorf wrote the tshuva. So let's say there's I mean, is it just theoretical? I mean, let's say there would be an actual, you know, member of your congregation who is a medical professional, and actually, let's say there's a difference between his hospital's protocols and what Rabbi Dorf said. Like, how would that actually play out? I mean,
that is a great question. I mean, don't know.
Is it a theoretical, interesting discussion, or?
Well, I mean, they both wrote, you know, kind of in their respective ways, that this tshuva is really meant for people who are in the position of making policy, and for guiding, you know, hospitals and caregivers and ethicists, and, you know, so right. I don't think it would come in an individual case like that, you know, right, where there's a system in place. I think it's meant to be on a higher level than that, right? To guide the system, you know, l'chatchila, right?
Yeah.
So, and do you have any thoughts about that question?
About the like who should they follow?
No, in terms of how you're, you know, where these are kind of manifesting personally in your community.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's just, I mean, at least in our community, it is interesting to see, like, you know, I'm actually surprised, because like if you look at even the Haredi poskim, who tend to be, you know, who tend to be very conservative, even politically conservative, right? But the idea of pikuach nefesh is just so strong for them, not for everyone. It's such a strong idea that it's interesting to see them, let's say, in terms, if you want to map it onto the political spectrum in America, in terms of how cautious people are being, and that tends to somewhat fall on political lines. But you see these Haredi poskim who are like way outflanking people in terms of concern of pikuach nefesh. And I find that to be very, very interesting, and what that's going to do to communal dynamics also in interesting ways.
Beautiful. Yeah. Any other closing comments, friends? Thank you so much for joining us. Interestingly, I've seen some of the same faces that we see at midnight, but also several new faces, which is wonderful. And maybe we should do a 2-for-1 special next year, or we do a daytime one and a nighttime one, or an Erev one and a nighttime one. Anyway,
absolutely.
It's always great to learn with you, Rabbi Antine, and to bring our communities together feel very grateful to have such a wonderful colleague and friend down the road. And the fact that you're also from Cleveland makes it even sweeter. And thank you all for tuning in. We wish you a Chag Sameach and good health and strength and patience, and for you and for your loved ones. And as Rabbi Antine said a few minutes ago, if either one of us can ever be of help to you or support to you or people that you know who need support, either spiritually or materially, please let us know so that we can be responsive and we can offer whatever we can to help our community through these very challenging times.
Thank you, Rabbi Raskin. It's been great learning with you and learning with
Likewise.
your community. Wish everyone a Chag Sameach. Thank you.
Chag Sameach.